December 7, 1941, near Klin, northwest of Moscow. The wind screamed across the steppe like a living thing. Snow fell sideways, thick, blinding, endless. The air was so cold it burned the lungs. Out of that white storm staggered a column of German soldiers, their gray uniforms crusted with ice, their rifles hanging loosely from numb hands. The Wehrmacht's unstoppable machine, the same that had crushed Poland, France, and much of Europe, was now limping through a nightmare of frost and fear. Sergeant Karl Weiss, 27, once a proud panzer crewman from Hamburg, dragged his boots through knee-deep snow, each step heavier than the last. His breath froze on his collar, his eyelashes glazed white. He looked back over his shoulder and saw what every man in the retreat dreaded: the horizon, moving a distant, low rumble, growing louder by the minute. "Panzer, 9, he whispered hoarsely. "That's not ours." Through the veil of snow came dark shapes rolling forward in disciplined formation, barrels glinting faintly through the haze. The sound was unmistakable now, the growl of Soviet T-34 tanks. Their broad tracks crushed the ice and churned up frozen soil, advancing like predators in the snow. The ground trembled with each metallic thunderclap of their approach. Weiss stumbled and shouted to the men ahead, "Tanks! Soviet tanks!" But the line was already breaking. Panic spread like wildfire. Dozens of soldiers, infantry from the 3rd Panzer Division turned in confusion, some dropping weapons, others clutching frostbitten hands to their faces as the sound of artillery shells began to whistle overhead. A blast tore the air apart, hurling snow and bodies skyward. Weiss hit the ground, face buried in the freezing powder. The shockwave rolled through him, muffled by the endless white. When he looked up, he saw smoke rising in the distance, black columns marking the path of the Soviet counterattack. The retreat was no longer orderly. It was chaos. "Back to the tree line," an officer screamed, his voice barely audible over the howl of wind and war. "Form up, damn it!" But there was no formation left. Men scrambled through the snow, tripping over their own fallen comrades. Machine guns clattered weakly from somewhere behind them, a pitiful defense against the advancing steel. The Soviets had come prepared for winter, their tanks insulated, their engines greased for the cold, their crews wrapped in fur and confidence. The Germans, by contrast, were dressed in thin wool coats and false arrogance, victims of Hitler's arrogance and logistical blindness. Weiss crawled toward a half-frozen ditch, dragging his wounded friend, Private Otto Brandt, by the collar. Brandt's leg was mangled by shrapnel, his face pale beneath layers of grime and ice. "They're coming, Karl, they're—" "I know," Weiss hissed, throwing him into cover, just as another explosion rocked the field. Chunks of ice and debris rained down, thudding against his helmet. He peeked over the ridge. Through the haze, the T-34 seconds appeared clearer, now sleek, monstrous silhouettes painted with red stars, their turrets rotating methodically. The lead tank fired, and a German truck erupted in flames. The flickering orange glow cut through the gray, painting the snow in hues of death. Behind him, the remnants of the 3rd Panzer were retreating blindly. The officers had lost control. Some men ran without rifles, others without boots. The frozen field that had once been their highway to Moscow was now a graveyard. The myth of German invincibility was dissolving into smoke and snow. Weiss's hands trembled as he reloaded his rifle, though he knew it was useless. The rifle's bolt was stiff from ice. The barrel cracked with frost. "This isn't war anymore," he muttered, half to himself. "This is slaughter." Overhead, the sky pulsed faintly as Soviet artillery thundered from beyond the horizon. The smell of oil and cordite filled the air, mixing with the sharp tang of burning rubber. In the distance, faint voices shouted in Russian orders carried by the wind. The sound of tank treads grew louder, closer, unstoppable. Weiss gritted his teeth, glanced at the wounded Brandt, and whispered, "We have to move. Now." He slung Brandt's arm over his shoulder and pushed forward through the whiteout, every step an act of defiance against the cold and the inevitable. Behind them, the earth shook as the first T-34 crested the ridge. Its gun turned toward the retreating Germans. The Red Army had arrived. December 8, 1941, east of Klin, 50 kilometers from Moscow. The sun never truly rose that morning, only a dull silver glow filtered through the blizzard, casting long ghostly shadows over the snow-cloaked fields. The wind howled like artillery, carrying with it the cries of retreating men and the grinding steel chorus of Soviet T-34 seconds pushing forward through the storm. Sergeant Karl Weiss trudged along a narrow forest road, half carrying, half dragging Private Otto Brandt through the drifts. The snow was waist-deep in places, the cold so merciless it gnawed through wool, leather, and skin. Around them, remnants of the 3rd Panzer Division stumbled in silence, broken silhouettes of men who had once marched with confidence toward Moscow, now reduced to shivering ghosts retreating from it. Behind them, the earth trembled again. The sound was rhythmic, metallic. The tanks were closing in. Weiss dropped Brandt against the base of a pine tree and peered through the swirling snow. At first, he saw nothing, only the white, infinite void. Then, like phantoms emerging from the fog, came the Soviet vanguard, a column of T-34 seconds, engines roaring, turrets swiveling, their tracks crushing the frozen corpses of abandoned vehicles. Between them, clusters of Soviet infantry in long padded coats advanced in staggered lines, rifles slung, bayonets fixed. The Red Army was not rushing, they were hunting. Weiss's frostbitten hands shook as he fumbled with his rifle. "They're flanking us," he muttered. "They're cutting off the road to Kalinin." Brandt coughed, blood spotting the snow. We're finished, Karl." A shell screamed overhead and detonated nearby, spraying dirt and ice in a deafening roar. The concussion knocked Weiss flat. He rolled onto his side and saw, in horrifying slow motion, a German SDKFZ 251 half-track explode in a fireball 50 meters away. The flames flickered orange against the blinding white, a cruel parody of warmth. From the forest edge, Lieutenant Vogel, one of the few officers still holding command, shouted frantically, "Form a line! Hold them back until the wounded are clear!" His voice cracked under the gale, but a handful of soldiers obeyed, setting up machine guns behind snowdrifts, their barrels steaming in the cold. The MG-34 seconds opened fire, spitting tracer rounds into the storm. For a fleeting moment, the sound of German gunfire returned to the field. Then the tanks responded. A thunderous volley erupted from the T-34 seconds, shells tearing through the snowbank defenses like paper. Men vanished in clouds of flame and smoke. Shrapnel whirled through the air, slicing through uniforms, flesh, and bark. One shell exploded so close that Weiss felt the shockwave punch the breath from his chest. He blinked through the haze. The machine gun nest ahead was gone, just blackened limbs and twisted metal. The Soviets were still advancing, methodical, unrelenting. Weiss could make out their silhouettes now. Tank commanders standing half exposed from turrets, faces wrapped in wool, shouting orders over the wind. Behind them, red banners flapped faintly in the storm symbols of vengeance made flesh. Brandt tried to rise but collapsed back into the snow. "Leave me," he croaked. Weiss ignored him, slinging the rifle over his shoulder. "Not yet, Otto. We're getting to the woods." He hoisted his comrade again and stumbled forward, boots crunching in the frost. The forest loomed closer, a tangle of skeletal birch trees offering thin cover. All around them, the air was alive with chaos. The whine of tank shells, the hiss of fire meeting snow, the distant cries of men whose courage had frozen long before their bodies did. Behind them, Lieutenant Vogel made one last desperate stand. He stood knee-deep in snow, firing his Luger at the approaching tanks. His shots pinged harmlessly off their armor. A moment later, a shell from the lead T-34 obliterated him, leaving only a smoking crater. Weiss reached the tree line just as another explosion lit the field behind him. He turned once more and saw the truth of the Eastern Front. Dozens of gray uniformed figures running, slipping, collapsing in the snow, their discipline shattered. Some dropped to their knees and raised their hands toward the oncoming tanks. Others simply vanished beneath the treads. The once proud Wehrmacht, conquerors of Europe, were now running for their lives across a wasteland of ice and smoke. Weiss pressed on through the trees, his breath ragged, his face raw with frostbite. In the distance he could hear the distinct clatter of Soviet submachine guns and the harsh bark of Russian voices echoing through the woods. Winter had chosen its side. December 9th, 1941. Western Russia, near the Volokholamsk Highway. The night was a thing of pure cruelty, moonless, windless, and colder than death. The snow no longer fell. It simply hung in the air, drifting lazily like ash over a battlefield that refused to sleep. The forest had thinned into open ground again, and what remained of Sergeant Karl Weiss's platoon now trudged through the vast, lightless steppe, a scattered procession of men too numb to feel fear anymore. The silence was broken only by the crunch of boots on ice and the faint, rhythmic clanking of distant tank treads. The Soviets were still coming. Weiss could barely tell where the horizon ended and the sky began. Everything was white, infinite, indifferent. He tightened the scarf around his face, frozen stiff with frost, and glanced at the man beside him. Private Otto Brandt, pale and half delirious, leaned heavily on him. His leg was blackened with frostbite now. Each step left a streak of blood on the snow. Behind them, a handful of soldiers followed 5 men from what had once been 200. Their uniforms hung loose, their weapons slung uselessly across their backs. Some muttered prayers. Others stared blankly ahead, eyes glazed and hollow. The proud black cross of the Wehrmacht on their helmets was now buried beneath layers of ice and failure. "Keep moving," Weiss whispered, his voice raw. "We find shelter before dawn, or we freeze here." No one answered. Perhaps they couldn't. A faint orange glow flickered on the horizon, the remnants of a burning convoy. The Soviets had struck it hours ago. Now it smoldered like a funeral pyre in the distance, sending thin trails of smoke curling into the freezing night. The wind carried the scent of oil, burnt rubber, and something worse, the heavy, sickly sweetness of death. Weiss led the group toward the wreckage. "Supplies," he muttered. "Maybe food. Maybe warmth." When they reached the site, they found 3 overturned trucks, their contents spilled into the snow. Frozen bread, scattered ammunition, and the shattered bodies of drivers lay half-buried under drifts. A dead horse, still harnessed to a wagon, stood frozen upright, its eyes glassy, its nostrils encased in ice. Weiss knelt beside one of the trucks and pried open a crate. Inside were Soviet-issued rations, likely captured weeks before. He smiled grimly. God bless irony. The men tore at the hard bread with shaking hands. Weiss looked up at the stars dim and cruel behind a thin veil of cloud and listened. There it was again, the low, distant rumble of tanks. It echoed through the ground, faint but certain. "Move," Weiss hissed, shoving Brandt to his feet. "They're still on our tail." The group staggered onward, leaving the burning convoy behind. The sky began to lighten with the first pale hint of dawn. A bitter wind swept across the plain, dragging loose snow into ghostly spirals. One of the soldiers, Corporal Heinrich Lutz, slipped and fell to his knees. "No more," he gasped. "Let them come." Weiss turned on him, eyes wild. "You want to die out here like a dog?" Lutz only smiled weakly. "Better than freezing while running from ghosts." He pulled off his gloves and stared at his blackened fingers, flexing them slowly. "Can't even feel them anymore," he said quietly. Then he simply sat down in the snow. Weiss stared for a moment, then turned away. He had seen this before, the slow surrender of men to the cold. Once they sat, they never rose again. The group pressed on. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time had lost meaning. The world was a blur of white and gray, and the cold was now a living thing, gnawing at the edges of sanity. Brandt mumbled nonsense, eyes unfocused. His breath came in shallow bursts. Weiss didn't dare stop. Then, out of nowhere, came a sound that froze him, in place the shriek of artillery. A second later, the ground behind them exploded in a shower of fire and ice. The Soviets had spotted movement. "Down!" Weiss roared, The men dove into the snow as shells rained across the field, one after another, lighting the dawn in brutal flashes. When the barrage stopped, Weiss lifted his head and saw dark shapes emerging from the horizon. Soviet infantry, dozens of them, marching in formation through the snow, rifles raised, bayonets glinting. Weiss's stomach twisted. "We're surrounded," he breathed. He looked to Brandt, barely conscious now. "Stay with me, Otto. Don't you dare close your eyes." The Red Army was closing in, their shouts echoing through the frozen air. The Germans had no strength left to fight. Their weapons were frozen, their ammunition wet, their spirits shattered. Weiss raised his rifle anyway, not out of defiance, but out of instinct. The last thing he saw before the Soviets reached them was the sunrise, a pale red light spilling across the endless white field, as if the snow itself were bleeding. For the first time in months, he felt something close to peace. The war, the pride, the orders, all of it faded beneath the quiet hum of the Russian winter. The steppe swallowed the last of the retreating men, and the tanks rolled on toward Moscow. December 10th, 1941, outskirts of Klin, Russia. The world had turned to ice and silence. The blizzard had passed, but in its wake lay stillness, a terrible, suffocating stillness that seemed to stretch to the horizon. Smoke curled lazily from the carcasses of tanks and trucks frozen into grotesque shapes. The snow was pitted with shell craters and stained with long, dark trails where men had crawled and died. The German advance on Moscow was over. The Eastern Front had swallowed it whole. Sergeant Karl Weiss lay half-buried in the snow, barely conscious. His rifle was gone, his helmet cracked, and his uniform stiff as armor from the cold. He could hear faint movement nearby, muffled voices, foreign commands shouted through the freezing wind. Soviets. They were close now. Through half-frozen eyelids, he watched as T-34 tanks rolled past the ridge, their treads creaking over the crusted snow. Red stars gleamed dully on their turrets. Between them, Soviet soldiers trudged methodically, bayonets fixed, scanning the field for survivors. Their white winter cloaks blended seamlessly into the landscape, ghosts reclaiming their land. Weiss tried to move but felt nothing below his waist. He turned his head and saw Private Otto Brandt lying beside him motionless, eyes open and glazed with frost. Weiss swallowed hard, his throat raw with thirst and grief. "Otto," he croaked. "Wake up! We made it, we!" But the words broke into a whisper. The war that had begun in triumph and roaring engines and firestorms over Europe had ended here in a whisper over frozen ground. From the tree line, a burst of automatic fire echoed. Soviet troops were finishing off the stragglers. The sound was distant, almost muffled by the snow. Weiss felt no anger now, only a hollow acceptance. The men around him, scattered across the white expanse, were no longer soldiers. They were remnants of an illusion. The shattered fragments of a machine that believed it could conquer Russia. He closed his eyes and let the wind wash over him. For a moment, he thought he could hear something else beneath the quiet, a soft, steady rhythm. Footsteps. A shadow fell across his face. Slowly, Weiss opened his eyes. A Soviet infantryman stood above him, rifle slung, a thick fur cap pulled low over his brow. The man looked young, no more than 20. His breath came out in misty clouds as he studied the wounded German. For a long moment, neither moved. Then the Russian lowered his weapon and knelt. "Visayo, Visayo," he said softly. "It's over." Weiss stared at him, unsure if it was mercy or mockery. The soldier reached into his coat and pulled out a small flask. He unscrewed it and pressed it into Weiss's trembling hand. The liquid inside burned like fire. When he drank it might have been vodka. It might have been salvation. When he looked up again, the soldier was already walking away, vanishing into the white like a phantom. All around, the Red Army was advancing, columns of men and tanks moving west, banners flapping in the icy wind. They had broken the myth of the invincible Wehrmacht. Moscow still stood, And for the first time since the invasion began, the German army was in retreat. The cost had been unimaginable, but the tide had turned. Weiss let the flask slip from his fingers. His vision blurred. The world seemed to fade into a haze of gray and white. He thought of home, of the Elbe River, of his mother's voice, of summer days that felt like another lifetime. A faint smile touched his cracked lips. "Too far," he whispered. "We went too far." The cold took him gently, like a curtain closing. Hours later, Soviet soldiers combing the field found his body beside the ruined trucks. They covered him with snow and moved on, leaving no marker, no name. He became one of thousands, anonymous, frozen, forgotten. But in the grand silence of the Russian steppe, their story remained written in ice and smoke. The moment when arrogance met endurance, and winter itself became a weapon. Above the battlefield, snow began to fall again, soft and endless, erasing the footprints of war. The tanks rumbled onward toward the west, their engines echoing into eternity. The Red Army had survived the impossible, and the legend of German invincibility died in the snow.